Have you ever walked away from a conversation, replaying every word in your head, wondering if you were the bad person? You said no politely. You explained yourself clearly. You didn't insult anyone, and yet, somehow, you still felt guilty. So you apologized. You changed your plans. You gave in, not because you were wrong, but because you couldn't shake the feeling that you had hurt someone. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes that guilt isn't coming from your conscience. It's coming from a system of emotional pressure designed to keep you agreeable, available, and easy to control. And the people most vulnerable to this trap are not selfish people. They're the kindest people in the room. Today we're going to break down the hidden cost of being nice all the time, how guilt loops are built, why empathetic people fall into them, and how to break free without becoming cold, bitter, or selfish. The story that reveals the pattern. A therapist once described a client named Claire. Claire was the type of person everyone liked. She remembered birthdays. She helped coworkers after hours. She was the friend people called during crises. But Claire came to therapy exhausted and anxious. She believed something was wrong with her because every time she told her partner no, even politely, the same thing happened. He wouldn't yell. He wouldn't argue. Instead, he'd pause, look disappointed, and quietly say, "I thought I could count on you." That sentence alone was enough. Claire would feel a wave of guilt, her stomach would drop, and suddenly she'd change her answer. Not because she was weak, but because she cared. And that's the secret behind emotional guilt loops. They don't need force. They just need access to your conscience. How the guilt loop is built. Manipulation rarely begins with obvious control. It begins with intimacy. People who rely on guilt first learn who you are. They observe your values. They notice how quickly you apologize, how much you care about harmony, how uncomfortable you are with disappointing people. Then the pattern starts. First, small favors. Then expectations. Then emotional pressure wrapped inside compliments. "You're the only one I can rely on." At first it sounds like appreciation, but over time it becomes obligation. Because the moment you can't show up, the message changes. What happened to you? And suddenly the person you were 5 minutes ago, the one with limits, needs, and boundaries, starts to feel like a disappointment. That's when the guilt loop begins. Why empathetic people fall into it. You might think manipulative people target the naive, but in reality they often target the most self-aware people. Why? Because introspective people question themselves first. Instead of thinking, "Something about this feels wrong," they think, "Maybe I'm being selfish." So they analyze the situation repeatedly. They replay conversations. They search for mistakes. And in trying to be fair to everyone, they end up being unfair to themselves. Psychologically, this happens because empathy can slowly transform into self-erasure. You start believing that being kind means always being available. Being moral means absorbing discomfort. Being loving means sacrificing yourself. But kindness without boundaries is not virtue. It's vulnerability. When guilt stops being a compass. In healthy situations, guilt is useful. It tells us when we've harmed someone. It pushes us to apologize and repair. But inside a guilt loop, guilt stops functioning as a compass. It becomes a cage. You begin feeling guilty not for doing something wrong, but for doing something different from what someone expected. You say no to a request, they feel hurt, and suddenly their feelings feel like your responsibility. So you start associating guilt with goodness. If you feel bad, you must be a good person. If you stop feeling bad, maybe you're selfish. And manipulators rely on exactly that belief. Because once guilt is activated, they don't have to ask for anything. You'll volunteer, the programming behind it. For many people, this pattern didn't start in adulthood. It started much earlier. Growing up, love may have been conditional. Peace may have depended on keeping others happy. Approval may have come only when you were helpful, agreeable, and quiet. So you learned an unconscious rule. If people around me are upset, it must be my job to fix it. That belief grows up with you. It evolves into traits the world praises: empathy, emotional intelligence, patience, generosity. But beneath those traits can hide a deeper fear. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of being labeled selfish. So you tolerate more than you should, because guilt feels more familiar than freedom. The identity trap. Here's where the loop becomes dangerous. Eventually, guilt stops being a feeling. It becomes part of your identity. When someone says, "You're not helping me." What you hear is, "You're not a good person." That's why people over-explain. They justify their boundaries. They apologize repeatedly. They stay in draining relationships long after they've recognized the pattern, because leaving feels like betraying their identity as a good person. But being good should not require self-abandonment. The critical distinction: guilt versus responsibility. One of the most important psychological distinctions is this: guilt and responsibility are not the same thing. Guilt says, "I am bad." Responsibility says, "I made a choice." Guilt paralyzes. Responsibility clarifies. If you genuinely hurt someone, responsibility means acknowledging it, apologizing, repairing the damage. But many people carry guilt for things that were never their responsibility. Someone feels disappointed by your boundary. Someone reacts emotionally to your honesty. Someone doesn't get what they wanted. None of those automatically mean you did something wrong, yet the guilt loop convinces you otherwise. But many people carry guilt for things that were never their responsibility. Someone feels disappointed by your boundary. Someone reacts emotionally to your honesty. Someone doesn't get what they wanted. None of those automatically mean you did something wrong, yet the guilt loop convinces you otherwise. Why manipulators prefer guilt over control? Direct control creates resistance. Guilt creates self-control. When guilt is activated, you start policing yourself. You become the one who apologizes first, fixes every conflict, anticipates everyone's emotional needs, avoids saying no. From the outside, it looks like kindness, but internally it feels like exhaustion. Because you're not just managing your own emotions, you're managing everyone else's too. And eventually you wake up emotionally bankrupt. Not because you gave too much, but because you gave for the wrong reasons. Breaking the loop. Breaking the guilt loop rarely looks dramatic. It doesn't require confrontation. It usually begins with something quieter: awareness. You start asking different questions. Instead of, "Why do I feel guilty?" you ask, "Did I actually do something wrong?" Instead of, "How do I make them feel better?" you ask, "Am I responsible for fixing this?" Sometimes the honest answer will be yes, but many times the answer will be no. And that realization is uncomfortable, because people who benefited from your constant availability will notice the change. They may call you distant, cold, selfish, but what they're really reacting to is the loss of control. The power of disappointment. One of the hardest skills to learn is allowing people to be disappointed. Not fixing it, not explaining it endlessly, just allowing it. Because when someone uses guilt to control you, your refusal to collapse will always be interpreted as cruelty. But boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity. You are not responsible for how people interpret your limits. You are only responsible for communicating them honestly. And something interesting happens when you stop reacting to guilt pressure. The loop loses its power, because the system only works if you participate. What you reclaim. When people finally step out of the guilt loop, they don't just gain time. They reclaim something deeper: their dignity. They stop apologizing for reasonable boundaries. They stop shrinking their needs. They stop performing kindness for approval. And ironically, they often become more compassionate, not less, because their empathy is no longer driven by fear. It's driven by choice. If this message resonates with you, remember this: feeling guilty does not automatically mean you did something wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional residue left behind by people who refuse to carry their own discomfort. For years, you may have believed your strength was your willingness to endure, your patience, your silence, your ability to absorb everyone else's emotions. But real strength is different. Real strength is the ability to remain kind without abandoning yourself, to care about people without surrendering your boundaries, to let others be uncomfortable without assuming you caused it. Because the moment you stop apologizing for your existence, you stop being controlled. And what replaces guilt is clarity.